Pull up a chair and tell me your memory. Why does it matter to you? I want to hear your story, your point of view. Tell me what happened to you.
All right, today I have as my guest a good friend of mine, actually a good friend of my daughter's as well. She introduced me to the man, Will Sonheim. Will is a filmmaker and performer from Arkadelphia, Arkansas, now living and working in Chicago, Illinois. Most recently, he directed Claire McFadden's web series, Denise Sells Houses, which screened at the Just for Laughs Comedy Festival in Montreal last year. You can stay up to date with his work by subscribing to his Substack newsletter, Pillow Fort. Welcome to the show, Will Sonheim.
Hi, Jay. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Man, it's an honor, man. You're one of my heroes relative to some of the creations that you've done over the years. But I'm not going to get into that right now. I'm just going to ask you if you're ready to tell your story.
Yes, I can jump right in. I grew up in the small town of Arkadelphia, Arkansas. It's about 10,000 people. On the water tower when you drive in, it says it's a great place to call home, which I would agree with largely. It was a small town. Arkansas, it's the natural state. So it was a lot of growing up and running around in places that had kind of capital letter proper names. So it would be the bluff, the lake, the river, the creek. And both of my parents are English professors. The life of the mind and creativity and, my imagination was sort of everywhere in our house. Bookshelves full of books, lots of places to exercise my imagination, whether it was running around in the woods or reading or drawing. And then from a very young age, I think I was excited about sort of the world beyond this small southern town that I grew up in, and had all these sort of windows into that world, both through my parents' jobs at the university. I met professors and students of all kinds of disciplines. So my world felt much larger in those ways. I'm building up towards my one story, and it's peppered with lots of little anecdotes and asides. One of which is that a crucial aspect of my youth was that we had a yard sale when I was in, I think, second grade. And with the funds from our yard sale, we had just enough to either buy a television or a dog. And we went unanimously for dog. So for my early years, not only didn't we have cable, but there was no television at all. There was one close call where we thought we were getting gifted a TV from some grandparents, but it was a bread maker. And that was a real twist, a real plot twist in my youth. So it meant that at one point we got a television, but we still just had the basic channels. This was when we had rabbit ears, no cable, sort of the basic three. But it did mean that on PBS, we had access to certain British comedies, and we had access to Whose Line Is It Anyway? And so one of the few shows that we would all watch together as a family was Whose Line? So I remember watching that, started in middle school, and it really, really blowing my mind. I think there's something magic about both having things that were, cracking me up as a kid, and then also watching my parents laugh very hard. As a family, we were just delighted by this program. And again, because I was in this small town, I think my parents are two of the most creative people I know, and they did a great job of, if something didn't exist, finding a DIY version of creating that experience, of trying to bring the world to us if we couldn't always go out to the world. And part of that experience was also supported by my grandmother, who I think the summer after 7th grade we were visiting in Denver, where my grandparents were, and she found a little improv class at, a community center or a library in Denver. And so that, I think, was the first moment where I realized that I could maybe do this thing that I had seen on TV, do my own version of it through improvisational comedy. And it was an absolute blast. We were very much a family and a group of kids and friends who were running around with movie cameras, making our own movies and playing. I often think that, especially with film, which is something that I do now for work and as a career, that felt like a way to extend the window of how long I could play pretend. I think just when I would have transitioned into just hanging out or chilling or something, we got our hands on a movie camera and we could film things, and it extended that period of just playing pretend with your friends sort of indefinitely. I know I'm still very much inside of that window. Okay, so this brings me up to 8th grade. These are all of the ingredients you need to know for the story of my 8th grade birthday party, which was a disastrous Whose Line Is It Anyway themed party. The first part of it that was a disaster in my mind was I took all the wrong lessons. At a core level, I misinterpreted what made me a fan of this show. And so I thought, if I have a Whose Line Is It Anyway themed birthday party, I can invite 3 friends because there are 4 contestants on the show. And so instead of having a show that was all the things I loved about improv, about the freedom, the reactivity, the presence, the being quick on your feet, instead what I copied was the actual formula of the Drew Carey television program Whose Line Is It Anyway. So I thought, I can invite 3 friends. I can have 1 host. That's probably going to be a parent, just working with, not a parent, but a parent. And I have to film the whole thing. So what it meant was that then for my birthday party, I didn't invite whole swaths of my nearest and dearest friends who I thought might not be interested, rightly so, in this very rigid adaptation of the Whose Line Is It Anyway television show. And I filmed the whole thing. I had my older brother stand in the corner of our living room. We set up 4 chairs on the other side of the living room, and he had a little mini DV camera. So there's the old in between kind of beta or VHS tapes. So they're the smaller tapes, but you're still shooting on tape. And he posted up in the corner and filmed the whole birthday party as my mom truly did her best in the role of Drew Carey to run us through a series of games. And I feel like there's always a degree of pressure on birthdays. I get better and better at it in a linear straight line as I get older. I have my ups and downs. But there's always sort of the pressure of, this day is special, everyone tells you. It should be, you should have a certain kind of day on a birthday. And so it was all of those feelings amplified by the fact that I was filming it, amplified by this fact that I was kind of bombing in my own home in front of my friends. And so the memory is just an early kind of foundational memory of feeling the disconnect between my idea of the thing and my fantasy of the freedom of improv and the freedom of, this artistic expression, feeling its smallness, feeling my own badness in comparison to what I had envisioned. And then I made the mistake of sort of right afterwards, this was pre-video cell phones, but watching it back right away. So I have this memory of my friends over my shoulder. I flipped out the little viewfinder, and within, 20 minutes of having not a great set, as I can now reflect back on, of, the ephemeral art form of improv, I was watching it back. I was a year older. I was watching this, what felt like, kind of birthday party go off the rails, and with 2 of my good friends over my shoulder. And I destroyed the tape moments later. I pulled the tape out, and that kind of compounded everything into this ball of, not only was I embarrassed about the party, what I had asked my family and friends to do, how I had done, I was, as it was happening, actively embarrassed about how I was handling it. It feels like as an adult now, sometimes a moment where I'll just think, I think I'm throwing a tantrum right now, but it's all happening inside of me. It's all the same emotions. Just now I might not pull the tape out in front of my parents, who had just put a lot of effort into making a themed birthday party for me. So it was sort of, it was this moment of trying in some ways to express or capture my love for this art form, for comedy, and just feeling like I had missed the mark in some way. And the experience of it was sort of this slow motion train crash, like trying to run in a dream, or, trying to, not a train crash. I guess it was a slow motion car crash in which I was in the driver's seat. But yeah, I think that was my last themed birthday party.
That story pains me and delights me at the same time. And I got to tell you why, because I know you and I know you're a great filmmaker. I've seen a number of your films, etc. The idea of using your eighth grade party as a way to make basically a movie or a film or a TV show, or whatever you want to call it, copying the greats, Drew Carey and that. I mean, the idea is so absolutely great. And I like the idea of extending, how you said it, extending your pretend time or something, because just as a writer, personally, I find that when the world gets to be too much for me, I make up a world where everything works out. So I understand it. It's beautiful. Again, I know that you are a filmmaker, you teach film, video, etc. So to some extent, I do know a little bit about how that experience has impacted your life, but I'd like you to articulate it a little bit better. How do you think that what happened to you as an eighth grader, maybe even as a subsequent ninth grader, where you destroyed that piece of art, which I would have liked to see, but it's gone. How do you think that's impacted who you are today?
Yeah, I mean, now I can also honestly say I would have liked to have seen it too. So one takeaway is to just turn down that dial of the initial shame response
Yes.
of something not being good enough, and now having gone through, knowing how much of life is change and growth, I think instead of being so locked into the initial dissatisfaction with something not being what I had hoped it would be, being able to, be more patient with all versions of myself, both past and present. I think too, it taught me I can now tell that story, and what feels like the real failure of this birthday party is genuinely funny to me. It's still painful.
Yes.
But I think as someone who loves comedy, who loves to laugh and to make other people laugh, in some ways I think taught me about how by actually risking things and by, risking failure, that tends to be kind of the richest soil
Yes.
for material. I think I also mentioned this a little bit in the midst of the story, but one reason I'm enjoying this conversation of this podcast, and I think the whole frame of it, is it's something I wrestle with, or has just been a continued kind of internal conversation, I think, over the course of my life and my life to come, of it's hard for me to pinpoint kind of forks in the road or singular instances where something, maybe altered the course of my life. A lot of times it can feel like a series of roundabouts that feel kind of eerily familiar, where I am remembering and forgetting and remembering and forgetting the same lessons. And I think if I look back over what I've done, it feels like a series of moments where I notice where I am, in the sense of, maybe high water marks, low water marks, but sort of noticing where I'm floating in the water in that moment, instead of maybe more of a definitive, and from that day forward, I never did that again. It kind of was like, oh, I haven't had another eighth grade birthday party, but I've had plenty of bad improv shows. And so there's something about just, I think noticing how what felt like a definitive moment at the time of, sort of a black and white moment now has all of these different shades, just with time and revisiting the story as I tell it. I think too, it makes me think about, I think there's real art to being a good fan of something. And part of that is knowing what part of the thing lights you up, and gets you excited. It reminds me of this Buddhist saying that I learned from George Saunders in his book, A Swim in the Pond in the Rain, to paraphrase as kind of, don't confuse the finger pointing at the moon for looking at the moon. Don't mix up, the gesture of trying to describe something for the immediate experience of the thing itself. And part of that experience for me as well was thinking that the fun of it would have been, filming it or replicating the form exactly. I was telling this story to my partner, Abby, and they were like, yeah, part of being an artist is knowing what you're trying to steal. I'm not trying to steal this exact format of a show. I don't want to do a sitcom as an eighth grader. I want the feeling of something that's alive and impromptu and present. So yeah, I think in terms of how it has influenced the rest of my life, it felt too like a moment of having a fantasy of how I imagined something going, and then in the moment of it happening, refusing to let go of the fantasy. And I think that's where kind of the ripping up the tape comes from, is a continued discomfort with actually being in the present, which is now for me the kind of whole joy of performing improvisationally, of making something up as I go along with my friends. Since that party, my partner of 12 years I met doing long form improv in college. I know you, I think, in many ways because your daughter and I have done improv together many times. And so I think that the actual improvisational spirit of accepting the present moment, I think that the whole yes and thing can get kind of reduced to corporate improv workshop lingo. But there is some core level of agreement and acceptance and presence that is, I had an idea at the start of this scene, or I had an idea at the start of this conversation, or even I had an idea about how I thought this podcast was going to go. And then I think the way it has influenced my life is that there are less and less instances where I'm kind of ripping up the tape afterwards, where instead I'm finding myself in the middle of a conversation thinking, this is different than I thought. That means it's real and it's actually happening, and I'll have this conversation instead of the one I thought I was supposed to have. Yeah, so I think that's... I feel like 12 different things.
No, but I'm going to say the ripping up the tape moment is really, really profoundly beautiful and accurate, I think. I think that rather than ripping up the tapes of our lives or experiences, to incorporate them in and say that was a real moment. You had a real moment with your friends, and your brother's helping you, and your mother's helping you, and everybody's trying to make this thing. And then, like you said, far better than I can say it, but the thing itself may not have been exactly what you'd envisioned, but it was something, and it was real, and it was in the moment, and that was profound. And it's a funny thing you talk about improvisation because, of course, all of us are improvising 24/7, but the idea of I've watched you, and I've watched Abby, your partner, and I've watched my daughter and some other folks, a lot of other folks doing improvisation. And sometimes it's really, really, really great, and I can't understand how people did that in the moment. And then other times I'm like, those poor people are up there and they look a little bit lost. And I'm like, and for me, the struggle is always getting over myself, even in terms of this stuff. And, it works for me as a writer, actor, whatever else, of being able to accept whatever comes out and say, well, I did that. I own that. That was me. And maybe the rest of the world doesn't need to see it again, but it did exist and it was there. So you've added to the world in a lot of ways, Will. I really appreciate you coming on the show, telling us your story. It's a profound one. I have to really reflect on it. But thanks for coming on, man, telling it.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. I think, as Drew Carey says on Whose Line Is It Anyway, it is all made up and the points don't matter. And that was my big takeaway ultimately.
Beautiful takeaway, my friends. We're gonna leave it right at that point. Thank you to you personally also for quoting Drew Carey, because I think he's right. So that's our show. Will Sonheim, the great Will Sonheim, coming on our show. Really appreciate it. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Sidelining Publishing, publishers of quality books, and most recently now, a new chess game, Black Hole Chess, 10 by 10 Black Hole Chess. A new way to play chess. You won't be able to use pawn e4, and controlling the center is impossible. Check out blackholechess.com and maybe even improve your game. So until next time, this is Jay Rehack, asking you all to please stay safe out there and try not to hurt anybody.